welcome to one of our NIHR School for Social Care Research Capacity Building webinars. I am delighted today to be welcoming Professor Carl May to talk to us about normalization process theory. So we have a very packed auditorium today, lots and lots of people interested in this. So we're hoping everybody wanted to manage to get in, because we have slightly overbooked, but I'm not sure whether our Zoom license allows us over a certain number. But anyway, those of you who are here, lucky you, because you got in. So first of all, my name is Yvonne Burks. I'm the Deputy Director of the school, so I'm going to chair the session today. We're going to have Carl talking for about 35-40 minutes, and then we're going to put questions in the chat because it's a big group of people, so to be able to manage that, you can put questions in the chat and I will filter those through to Carl at the end when we've got some time for questions. Okay, so Carl is a Professor of Medical Sociology at the London School of Hygiene, Tropical Medicine. He has a very strong track record in looking at science and technology studies, and also looking at implementation. And as a result of all of this work, he is the kind of the father and founder of normalization process theory, along with others. Just take it, Carl. It's you are. Everybody knows that you are. Now, we often get really great talks from people who help us to understand methods and theories, but I don't think we've actually had anyone who actually came up with the theory before. So this is a first for us and very exciting. And I think that probably explains some of the very, very unprecedented demand for this webinar. So we're very grateful to Carl for sparing the time to do this. And I'm going to hand you over to Carl, and he will talk to us about what you've all come to listen to, normalization process theory and social care research. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you all for coming and for your interest in my work. And I just had the opportunity to just quickly skim through the participants list, and I'm just delighted to see some old friends from the Netherlands and Norway and the UK and Ireland, as well as from new friends that I don't know yet. So look, I'm going to be talking about theory. Really important thing to say about theory. None of what I'm going to talk about now is philosophical speculation. There's nothing in this presentation that isn't drawn directly from empirical observation, either in the UK or the United States or Australia, the Netherlands, Norway, Ireland. That's an important thing to say, that we're not entering into a world of phenomenological hermeneutics here. We're talking about observations of real things in the world. Although one of the very first NPT papers that I submitted to a journal was criticised on the grounds that it was insufficiently French. And I've got a special slide about that later on. Okay, so look, a few words about me. I'm a sociologist. My work is organised around three main sorts of questions, and those are about how socio-technical transformations in care are motivated and shaped, and how new ways of thinking and acting and organising care are integrated in practice, and then how professionals and service users interact and how these interactions are shaped by innovations. So that's sort of what I do. I've been doing this for a very long time, since dinosaurs ruled the earth, since before anybody used Word. So I sort of feel as if my work has encompassed a great span of changes and shifts in the organisation of social and health care, and in the organisation of sort of practice as well. It's been very exciting. So I also need to acknowledge my chum Tracy Finch, who is the co-developer of some of the ideas that we're presenting here today, but who has also led on a really important project to turn these ideas into constructs that can be measured, and has developed useful instruments to do that. Tracy and I was just saying to Yvonne, have worked together since 1999, which just is like a long time, I sort of feel. Perhaps it feels longer for her than it does for me. I don't know. So there are three parts to what I'm going to say today. I'm going to talk about, well, what do we know about how implementation processes work, and that's an introduction to the theory. I'm going to talk about how we might think through implementation, and that's with reference to some concrete examples of published studies. And then I'm just going to briefly introduce some tools for applying the theory in practice. There is a lot of debate about what a theory is. I'm a bear of very simple brain, and I say that when we talk about theories, we're talking about rational explanations for observed phenomena. But there are lots of other words that people use around this sort of stuff. They talk about taxonomies and frameworks and models and things like that. And Per Nilsson in Sweden wrote this very good paper that sort of sets out the differences between them that I've summarized in this slide. Models are maps, frameworks are taxonomies, and theories are explanations. And if we just work within that framework, because that is actually a framework, then we get some sense of how the conceptual world can be divided up. Okay, so let's introduce normalization process theory, and it's got configured into implementation science. But I have to tell you something. When I started working in this field, there was no such thing as implementation science. And what I was interested in was how people operationalized and mobilized different ways of different forms of technology in practice. And that work started in the late 1980s when I did a doctoral thesis about how nurses interacted with patients who were dying. And I started to think about things like the nursing process and individualized nursing care and the attack on task orientation in nursing. And that made me think a lot about how ideas were translated into practice. Implementation science is a relatively new thing, and it's the study of methods to promote adoption and implementation of evidence-based practice. But look, implementation science is a methodological field. That's the most important thing to say about it. It's the study of methods. Methods to secure change. It's a very interesting field, and I enjoy being part of it, although how much a part of it I am, I'm not always so sure. But it's important to say implementation science and implementation processes are not the same thing. Implementation science is about methods of translation. It's a very medically modeled field. But implementation processes are really, really different to that. They're non-linear, they're dynamic, they're emergent, they're hugely complicated, they're full of people, and they're contextually very, very, well, let's put it differently. They are richly contextualized. And we can kind of see that when we start to think about what is to be implemented. When I talk about implementation, I talk about the translation of the strategic intentions of one group of actors into the everyday practices of others. And I say that the essence of implementation is collective action and collaborative work. Now, that's not to say that individual factors and motives and intentions are not important, but it is to say that I have yet to see an implementation process that didn't involve people working together. When we look at what's being implemented, we can see that it's often composed of one or three or four or two components. So we have the actual things that people are working on, the objects, if you like, the objects and procedures that people are working to implement. We have interaction strategies, the way in which implementing something changes the relationships between people. We have rules and resources, the ways that implementing things changes the rules, the roles, the things that people mobilize and use about themselves and others. And of course, it changes the organizing logic of activity. And a great example of that is what we're doing now. Nationally, everyone has implemented video conferencing. It's changed the ways that we interact in meetings like this. It's changed the rules of meetings like this. And of course, it's changed the resources that we draw on. But most importantly, it's changed the way that we give meaning to the actions that are involved in this. So now giving a paper is a very different thing, and it means something differently to what it meant 2 years ago. That's quite I used to use PowerPoint as an example, but I was increasingly talking to people who had no experience of a world without PowerPoint. So I don't know quite how I feel about mixing with people who have no experience of a world without PowerPoint. It sounds odd to me. Anyway, look, let's think again about implementation science. When we look at translating evidence into practice, what we find is a literature and a methodology that's highly procedural. We translate evidence into interventions, we rigorously evaluate those interventions, and then we find different ways of translating them, often after a gap of many years and several systematic reviews and a couple of policy documents and a white paper, into routine use. And after they've been in routine use for a bit, they become obsolete, they die, and they're replaced. But one of the really important things, and Geoffrey Braithwaite, who's just a great Australian health services researcher, has this fantastic view. What implementation sciences, implementation projects are about is they're complicated things that get settled into complex adaptive systems. Everything is messy and difficult and complicated. And we can see that when we look at real world implementation pathways. They are messy, they're complicated, they're adaptive, they're emergent, and we get these strategic intentions. But what we then see is that they're subject to processes of adaptive execution, and the people involved in them are constantly negotiating their capabilities and the contexts in which they're working in. And then bits of something become implemented and routinely incorporated into practice. Once again, those things are subject to obsolescence and death and decay. So we have these two very different ways of thinking about stuff. One is the language of writing a protocol or a grant application or a plan, and the other is the experience of trying to get something to work, to routinely incorporate something into the everyday practices of other people, which are always complicated, always messy, always difficult. So normalization process theory, I'm going to unpack these diagrams in a minute, but it deals with 3 levels of activity. It deals with a micro level of activity where people use and operationalize complex interventions. It deals with the implementation core, which is, if you like, the meso level of activity. It's how people work together to achieve goals. And of course, it has to deal with the macro level of activity, the contexts. And so we can see here, and on your screen, which might be a bit bigger than mine, you can see actually how we have developed collectively and collaboratively these different ways of modeling the constructs of a theory over what seems to me to be a very, very long time. We started this work in 2003. And the theory itself, which I'm going to describe in detail in a moment because I put this slide in the wrong place, characterizes 4 kinds of activities. It characterizes interventions, their implementation. So we have a thing, activities, embedding, which is a state, and then integration, which is a process, a set of activities. Now, the theory itself, there are probably about 400 NPT studies now, most of which have appeared in the last few years. I've already told you that the theory is empirically grounded, but you can see here how over time it's analytically iterative. It's been developed almost in layers over time, and then all of these people have been good enough to use it and to find it useful and to test it either in clinical trials or in cohort studies or in ethnographies or interview studies. Really fascinating body of literature, and I'm just leading on a systematic review of that literature now to explore some of these issues in a bit more detail. And the scholarship of some colleagues who've been working in this field is breathtaking. It's wonderful to read. When we think about normalization process theory, the most important thing to remember is it's all about the work. It's about purposive action and the investment of group resources, personal and group resources to achieve goals. It's about what people do rather than what they intend to do or what they believe, although beliefs and intentions are an important part of our understanding of implementation processes. But really, this is about action. What do people do? Why do they do it? And actually, why do these processes succeed or fail? And it comes from a moment. It comes from just a moment. In 2002, I was doing a study with colleagues, Tracy Finch, who I've mentioned already, and Francis Mayer and Linda Gask and Maggie Maud and others, about how do effective evaluations get done. And we chose telemedicine as an example, telecare we call it now. And I was talking to this medic who worked in an emergency department and about his experiences with telemedicine. And although he was a great proponent of these technologies, he said, you know, Carl, he said, the trouble with telemedicine is that it doesn't work. The name tells you that. If it worked, it would just be called medicine. And this is a kind of moment of phenomenological insight, because I thought, well, effectively, when we study things that are being implemented, we only know if they've been routinely incorporated in practice if they just disappear from view, if they become part of our taken for granted world, or people start saying, well, it's just how we do things around here. And that's what we're looking for in normalization processes. But actually, lots of other outcomes are possible. Some things don't get implemented effectively. Some things never become routinely incorporated in practice. Bits of things get lost. Bits of things stick. It's, again, a way of understanding a messy and complicated world. So let's have a look at the way that people have used it. And so we can start off by saying, well, what are the micro level properties of any intervention? And here's a model of a set of constructs about the capabilities that people have that allow them to do things, allow them to have confidence in each other, allow them to enact skills, and allow them to relate to the big contexts that they're in. And one way to look at this is to actually look at a real life study. So here's some work that I and colleagues did in NIHR Wessex Clark over the past few years. And we looked at barriers to implementing treatment escalation plans at end of life. So how can people record and have some sense of confidence that their preferences about how they will be cared for if they lose capacity be enacted? So we did a big scoping review. It's a shame we called it a scoping review, because the truth is it's actually a big, proper, systematic review of implementation processes. We did a big review of patient notes to understand what the decision pathways about end of life were. And then we did a practical implementation study of treatment escalation plans that some of you may have worked out in your head actually became the RESPECT pro forma that's incorporated in the patient notes in pretty much every hospital in the land now. But what we discovered very quickly was that you could characterize treatment escalation plans in terms of the kind of work that they do. So they call on us to do disclosure and recording and distribution and accountability work. And we can explore how they fit with the operational contexts in which they're based in. And we could do this with some confidence, because we were using constructs of NPT. So we were using ideas about interactional workability and relational and contextual integration and skill set workability. And we could see how the work of using the treatment escalation plan was about managing risks. And those risks were local and interactional and systemic and relational. But we could also see that the purpose was to convert individual preferences into collective action, and to convert collective action into organizational behavior. And when that happened, then we saw routine incorporation of the treatment escalation plan into patient care. Another way of looking at it is to say we saw something that converted individual patient trajectories into a common organizational process that can be quality assured. So win-win. We got a good sociological outcome and a good implementation science outcome from that study. It's a great piece of work with fabulous colleagues. When we look at the implementation core, we're looking at the social organization of collaborative work and collective action. And we see that in these ways. We say that that work is about building coherence and making an intervention meaningful, about cognitive participation and creating commitment to an intervention, and then about the collective action in which effort is invested. And finally, reflexive monitoring, the way that we appraise the work that people do when they implement an intervention. The way that they think about the intervention itself becomes really interesting. And here's a study that I did with colleagues, Claire Bamford and Paula Moynihan and the wonderful Ben Heaven. Ben Heaven was a PhD student, and I count him as my greatest success as a PhD student because although he was a great researcher, a point came in his life when he decided to go back to New Zealand, breed pigs and start his own brewery. And he lives a life of almost extraordinary happiness doing that. I'm very, very envious of him. We looked at how to implement menus in residential homes for older people with cognitive impairment and disabilities that were local authority funded and organised. It was a really, really interesting study. And Claire Bamford, who was the lead researcher on that, took what we knew about those mechanisms that drive and shape implementation processes, and she analysed the qualitative data using that. And she did this incredible job where she said, well, what do we know about the ideal conditions for implementation? What do we know about the real conditions of implementation? And how can we develop strategies to change that? And she organised her strategic kind of notions around the constructs of NPT. So we have this really interesting stuff where, and of course, I've just realised that hardly any of you can read this because it's so small and the slide is designed to be shown on a huge screen. But we have these extraordinary kind of interactions between data, theory, and interpretation. And the interpretations are all highly realistic and highly pragmatic. And that's the great joy of doing theoretical research with NPT, is it never takes you too far from the data, and the data never takes you too far from the real world work that people are doing. There seems to me so little point in doing research that simply gives us a lot of words. I really like the idea that theory is a practical thing that we can use to analyze and understand the real world and make plans for making that real world better. I know that's a slightly idealistic kind of way of thinking about it, but it appeals to me. And as I've done more and more work with this, the paradox that I've found is that the more theoretical my work has become, the more practically useful it seems to have become to people, which is a really quite a weird thing. Okay, so then when we look at how interventions are enacted in context, we have a mix of micro and meso and macro level processes. And we can start to think about a centrally important part of any implementation processes, which is how things interact with each other and how they spur particular kinds of negotiations between the objects of an implementation process, the actors that are delivering it, and the contexts in which it's being carried out. And here we can see two kinds of outputs from that process: normative restructuring, changing the rules and resources, and relational restructuring, changing the different ways in which people interact and relate to each other, that are big results of implementation processes. So here's another example. Fantastic work by Jeremy Seagrett and Dave Foxcroft and others. A big study done in Wales that sought to support people, support families with whose adolescent children were at risk of becoming caught up in substance misuse. Really interesting piece of work. And what they did was to produce a fantastic model using those constructs, capability, potential, capacity, action, and show how they interact with each other positively and negatively. And this is a great example, I think, of qualitative work that actually suggests the structure of social action. Often what we get with qualitative work is a thematic analysis that describes the data, but doesn't really explain what's going on. And the great benefit, to my mind, of theory-oriented work is that we can move beyond thematic description and actually explain the processes that are going on. And Seagrett et al.'s work is a fantastic example of that. And it really shows how an intervention works, what its effects are. Absolutely fantastic piece of work. I wish I'd been involved in that study. I really do. Now, at the beginning of this little talk, I talked about how an early NPT paper had been described by a peer reviewer as insufficiently French. And of course, what they meant by that was that it didn't pay sufficient attention to the work of Bruno Latour and Michel Caron and others who developed actor network theory. So recently I've done a diagram and given it a French name. So marge de manœuvre is actually the French for wiggle room. And so here's a model of why wiggle room is important. And it's about the relationships between people and things and contexts. So what we're saying here is that at every point, the capabilities of actors, of participants in implementation processes are negotiated. But the really important thing about this is that those mechanisms that I've described in those three diagrams I've just shown you are in fact mechanisms of self-organization in a complex adaptive system. Interventions that are plastic, that are malleable, and contexts that are elastic, that allow a fit and allow people to stretch and move things around, are actually also interventions that are surrounded by the possibility of adaptive execution. Adaptation is really, really important in implementation. That's my one little excursus into French social theory, the words marge de manœuvre. So let's have a think about what we can use to test and to understand the dynamics of implementation. And we do have tools, and everything that I've outlined so far can be very successfully used, and there's good evidence that it can be very successfully used as the basis of qualitative work. Both interview and observation and ethnography and documentary analysis. We've got good examples of all of those things. Always remember, NPT focuses on action, and that's what we're investigating, how people act and the mechanisms that shape and motivate their action. I want to start thinking about methods by simply saying that it's really, really important to use theory to support the design of implementation interventions and implementation processes. We know quite a lot about these processes, and it's really important to translate that knowledge into inputs into design and feasibility testing. And so what a theory helps us to do is to provide a rational framework for action. It helps us to think about strategies for success. And I pointed to that a few moments ago when I was talking about Claire Banford's study of implementing new menus in old people's homes. And it helps us to understand how and why implementation processes work, and we saw that in Jeremy Segrett and colleagues' studies. And it helps us to support transferability and generalization of interventions in practice. And I hope that's what the work that we did in Southampton about treatment escalation plans shows. So we can really build on these sorts of theoretical constructs to support intervention design and work with intervention users to develop highly participatory experience-based co-design of implementations. It's so important. While we're doing that, we can use the NPT toolkit, which allows us to identify areas where action and support is needed. I often see the NPT toolkit actually used as the basis for qualitative work, which is really interesting. It's available online, it's free. Everything that we do with NPT is free. The taxpayers already paid for it, and we're not going to charge them again. This is a simple thinking through implementation toolkit. And it does produce these very scientific looking radar plots at the end that tell us where we need to act. So you can see immediately that there's a lot of work that's not taking place around participation in this spider plot. And actually there's some big gaps in sense making. So we can see immediately that action is going to be deficient. This is from a real project, a real implementation project. We were actually looking at what it would take to build and put together a health services research unit between 4 Canadian universities. And then it became apparent as we did this that the gaps were pretty big and that nobody really wanted to fill them. And so we were able to stop that process and say, it's not going to work. Nobody wants to do these bits of the job. We saved all of those institutions a lot of money. But this is something that we can translate into actual studies in healthcare, and Elizabeth Murray and many colleagues, many very eminent colleagues put together a really super and very simple model of how using NPT analysis, which distinguishes between the intervention and the evaluation study, can be used to kill a study, to kill a clinical trial before it starts, to identify the things that aren't really going to work and aren't really going to happen. Okay. And then I talked about my colleague and friend Tracy Finch earlier on, and she and my other long-standing friend and colleague Tim Rapley led on a wonderful study to create the NOMAD scale, which is a tool, an instrument that will test normalization process theory constructs and will help us to use help us to use those constructs to plot progress in implementation. Nomad, I think, is now available in, I think, 9 languages, and that's a pretty wonderful outcome, I think, and it works really well. We've used it as a tool in a number of studies. It works well. It's highly validated. It's reliable, and actually, it seems really easy for people to fill in. Really easy for people to use. It's very flexible. You can change it around and do things with it. So, what can we say in conclusion? Well, we can say that the theory accurately characterizes important elements of implementation processes. But it's not just that. It's clear that they can be applied in stable and consistent ways. For me, the really important outcome and what makes it worth the money is it provides usable, workable, and practicable conceptual tools for understanding implementation and for doing feasibility and studies and process evaluations. And it can be applied flexibly. This is not a theory that is intended to be used by people with PhDs in postmodern philosophy. We've tried to organize it and develop it in a way that makes it workable in practice for people who are not career social scientists. So that's kind of where we've got to. I of course, have to draw attention to many funders and some that are not actually mentioned on this slide because I didn't have room. And to make clear that none of this is the fault of any government department in any country. And that's that. That's me. That's my presentation. I'd be delighted if you wanted to email me afterwards with questions or follow me on Twitter and hear me complaining about how miserable life is as a university professor. And sometimes point you to interesting papers or talks by others. Thank you very much for your kind attention. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I have got a few questions that have started to appear in the chat. The people got a bit sidetracked by the pigs at one stage, so I'm ignoring that. But I have the first question that came in was one from another Carl, a Carl to a Carl. I'm a bit worried that I won't get this question right, Carl. So would you like to present it for yourself? Ah, I thought it might be you.
So NPT, massively successful and a big part of lots and lots of applications for grants that we see on various funding committees, along with Trish Greenhalgh's NAS and co-design and all sorts of other concepts and stuff like that. But my question to you, Carl, is what's your sense of how many of the studies that adopt and how well of the studies that adopt the NPT actually really go on to test and develop it as you intended, rather than just chuck it in a grant application and then it's a shorthand for something much more vague, which they never fully reveal in their empirical work? Does it bother you?
Does it bother me? Well, there are two ways to look at this, I think. One is I think the tendency that you're describing is common to all kinds of models. I think it's equally common to the theoretical domains framework or the COM-B model in health psychology. It's equally applicable to the Paris model that Joe Rycroft Malone and others are working with. I think there's something about how people write grant applications and the expectation of many funders that they should have some sort of theoretical framework. So that's actually a successful implementation project on the part of funders. What I think is And I've been involved in systematic reviews of several different theoretical frameworks, not least the ones that I've been involved in. The thing that I would say is there are, and I'm sort of thinking about Roman Kislov's work here about what is theoretically informative, what is theoretically informed, and what is theoretically descriptive. So sometimes people need to use a theory as a shorthand way of dividing up the world and to describe their data and to describe what they think their data is going to look like. Sometimes they want to do work that is genuinely informed by theory and that explores its implications for their data. And sometimes they want to do work that is theoretically informative and that develops the theory in relation to the data. And that last group is a very small number of people because it takes a particular kind of training and aptitude to do that work. So I've done work with students that uses Susan Mickey's COM-B model. And I wouldn't presume to try to further develop that model. I mean, it's a hugely successful, much more successful than NPT model that is incredibly parsimonious. I mean, it doesn't do a lot of things that I want a theory to do, but it's still, you know, a powerful way of conceptualizing the world. And in that work, I think I've sort of thought about exactly the question that you're asking, which is, what is the role of the, what are the duties of the researcher to the ideas that they are mobilizing in a grant application or in a study design? And I have to say, I don't want to be responsible for that. It's difficult enough actually generating a theory. I think we have always said there is no correct way to, there is no one correct way to use NPT. Use it flexibly, use it how you want. And I'm very content that lots of people have done that. There are a couple of truly dreadful NPT papers. I mean, there really are, but no more truly dreadful NPT papers than there are from anything else. We're very lucky in the UK that we've got fabulous researchers working in health and social care, and some of the things that they do are really extraordinary. You know, I'll just pluck one out of the air. Abigail Tasman's work about the accreditation of doctors and validation of medical qualifications, or Sarah Knowles at York, her work about participation and PPI. These are really, really fantastic researchers doing wonderful work. I mean, I think we see a normal distribution, is what I'm saying, Carl. I think that's what we see. We see most people are using it okay in the middle, and then there are a small number of not very good studies, and then there are some really outstanding pieces of work. I don't know whether I've answered that question properly, Yvonne, but
no, I think that's fine, Carl. I've got these are I've got two questions here in the chat that I'm going to conflate around the overlap between NPT and other frameworks. So things like theories of change, although there was a slide in there that I thought other people might describe as a theory of change, and also things like the MRC framework. So how do you see them overlapping or not overlapping? Or
well, there are two things. There are two answers to that question. So the first is, how does NPT interact with other theories? NPT is a middle range theory. It only describes and explains a limited set of things. So it says, this is how implementation processes are motivated and shaped. If you want to understand that in relation to, for example, individual psychological factors, then you can federate NPT with COM-B or self-determination theory or something like that. If you want to do work that looks at implementation processes in the context, for example, of inequalities, you can federate it with relational inequality theory or intersectionality theory. It's designed to work with other theories. So there are certainly overlaps because nothing is ever completely original. You know, there are lots of ideas in NPT that you can trace back to, 200 years to whatever philosopher was banging about in, the 18th century over a glass of claret. We are, all of our ideas are the children of philosophical grandparents and others. So there's that. Things like the MRC framework are different. Those are ways of conceptualizing a field of practice and saying, these are things we need to take into account. The MRC framework isn't a theory. It does not explain anything. It just divides up the world in a way that is convenient for researchers. The same is true of some theories, some frameworks like the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research, which is a fantastic piece of scholarship, but it offers no explanations. It says these are things you must take into account if you're examining implementation processes, and it's remarkable that they're like the CIFA, Laura Dam-Schroeder's Consolidated Framework, and NPT were published in the same month in 2009. And what we had reached by cumulative empirical research it kind of appears a bit in CIFA, in their implementation process components, which they generated by library research, by literature review. So it kind of gives me some reassurance about NPT that these ideas sort of seem to fit with the zeitgeist or whatever. So it's a matter of comparative. These are not the same sorts of things. We're looking at apples and pears, is what I'm saying.
That's great, thank you. Probably got time for 1, 2 short ones. There is a question in the chat from Daniel who's asking about when you apply MPT to evaluate interventions, how would you improve on a specific domain of MPT? So how would you improve the coherence of an intervention?
How would you improve the coherence of an intervention? Well, I think there are what you're doing when you're dealing with coherence is you're looking at how people make things meaningful, the work that people do to make something meaningful for themselves. And so there are sort of acts of specification and planning and talking through that people need to do. But there's also some stuff about differentiation between different sorts of activities. One of the reasons that a lot of early telemedicine systems failed in practice was that doctors and nurses thought that what they were doing was exactly the same as what they would be doing if they had the patient in front of them in real life. And they very quickly discovered that it isn't. And I'm sure that there are lots of practicing professionals on this call who are doing telephone triage at the moment. I just had a telephone triage with a physio in Southampton because I mistakenly took up running. It was a mistake. I've learned my lesson. I'm never going to do it again. I've torn a tendon in my knee. So I had a telephone triage consultation in which he asked me a series of questions, and then I pointed at my knee and I said, "It hurts there." I was on the phone. But I mean, so these things are never the same as what we think they are, you know. I think I've actually got my youngest ever participant in a seminar there.
Oh yes,
with
we like to be groundbreaking.
Yeah, welcome. Become and a doll as well. I think become a social scientist like me, and so I think that's what I would say about this is that strategies to make things meaningful can be developed and co-designed with their users, and it's the co-design bit that becomes really important.
Thank you. That's marvelous. We are rapidly running out of time. I've got about 50 questions written down on a piece of paper here. I might email them to you, Carl. But I was slightly interested in the idea of your wiggle room concept and how that would relate to another concept of fidelity that people like to be very rigid about in trials sometimes, and how you kind of align those two things.
Well, of course, fidelity appears everywhere. So we work to make fidelity, but we also, over the life of a study or an intervention, adapt fidelity to fit our needs. So it's quite a complicated thing. Wiggle room, I think, is about adaptive execution. It's about saying, well, how much space do we have to make this work better? Okay. I do quite like calling it marge de manœuvre because my early work. Yeah,
I'm simple, so wiggle room work better for me.
Yeah, but you get kudos for having a French term.
Absolutely,
you know, it's really important. Undergraduates won't be interested in NPT unless we turn all these things into something French. And so there's a thing there. Sometimes we have no room. Sometimes there is no wiggle room.
Yeah.
And actually, when there's no when there is no marge de manœuvre, that things often just don't work.
Yeah.
You know, we see that in other aspects of our life. Yeah, you know, I don't have much wiggle room in my negotiations with British Gas. They're either going to come on the day that they say they are, or they're not. You know, and trying to get British Gas to modify its behaviour is an almost impossible task. So sometimes we can change things, sometimes we can't. But when we can, when we got room for manoeuvre, then room for wiggling, then we have the opportunity to modify and adapt. And that's really important, because that enables us to problem solve and troubleshoot through the life of an intervention.
Marvellous. I think that's a marvellous point on which to end. Lots of things coming in through the chat, thanking you for your talk, Carl. So very, very well received. Thank you so much. Very engaging talk as well. As a few people have asked for the slides, and I've explained to people that those will become available later in the year because you need those slides to be.
Yeah, I need to recycle this talk a few times.
Needs to recycle the talk. But as soon as we can, we will make them available.
But more or less everything that I have talked about is evident in those papers that I've mentioned. So all of our papers are open access. You can access them free. So
thank you. So it was great to have you. Really enjoyed it. If I could just quickly take this opportunity to highlight to people that our conference is on the 29th of March. Do feel free to sign up for that. But if I could also just remind people as well that our Capacity Building Awards went live yesterday. So there's another call for those if anybody's interested. There's a fairly long run in for those, so you've got time to look at those and apply. But thank you all for being here, but a huge thank you to Carl for turning out on a cold Tuesday at 1 o'clock in your marvellous library and telling us all about MPT. I'm sure lots of people will be emailing you, Carl.
I hope so, and feel free to do so. And thank you all very much for your interest in our work. And a couple of you have smiled at me throughout, and I get quite nervous when I'm giving a talk. So it was lovely of you to do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Also, I can see Madeleine Rosenbaum there, and I have found your email and I will reply to it. I absolutely promise.
Marvellous. Lovely to see you all. See you all soon.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.